This isn't just the story of a company, or a drug, or a family. This is the story of a crisis that swept through every corner of America, of communities shattered, of lives stolen, and of a system that allowed it all to happen while one family, the Sacklers, built a $35 billion empire. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the beginning. In the early 20th century, three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, rose from modest beginnings to become some of the most powerful figures in modern medicine. Arthur, the oldest, was a psychiatrist by training, but his true talent lay in marketing. Arthur Sackler didn't just promote medicine, he transformed how it was sold. He revolutionized pharmaceutical advertising, not by focusing on the public, but targeting doctors directly. If you could convince a doctor, you could control the patient. In the 1960s, Arthur marketed Valium, the first drug to surpass $100 million in sales. He created full-page magazine ads, sponsored educational events for physicians, and paid for scientific-looking brochures. He didn't just sell a pill, he sold a feeling of relief, of peace, of control. With that success, the brothers purchased a small pharmaceutical company, Purdue Frederick. Years later, it became Purdue Pharma. Arthur died in 1987, but his legacy, the blueprint for aggressive drug marketing, would be carried on by the rest of the Sackler family. And their next creation would change everything. In 1996, Purdue launched a new painkiller, OxyContin. It was based on Oxycodone, a powerful opioid, but what made it different was its time-release formula. Purdue claimed it would relieve pain for up to 12 hours with a lower risk of addiction than traditional opioids. That claim that OxyContin was less addictive was never backed by long-term studies. It was a promise without proof. But the FDA approved it. And then the real campaign began.
Purdue launched OxyContin with the most aggressive marketing campaign the pharmaceutical industry had ever seen. They spent over $200 million promoting it in just its first few years. They sent out more than 34,000 promotional videos to doctors across the country. They sponsored pain management seminars, printed glossy brochures, gave free samples, and paid for luxury retreats. Sales reps were trained to say that less than 1% of patients became addicted. It wasn't true, but it sounded reassuring. And doctors believed it. The campaign wasn't just clever, it was calculated. Purdue targeted general practitioners, not pain specialists, because they wrote the most prescriptions. They focused on small towns, rural communities, places where people were more likely to suffer from chronic pain and where scrutiny was low. In Appalachia, in Ohio, in West Virginia, prescription numbers exploded. By the year 2000, sales of OxyContin topped $1 billion. Purdue's army of reps was rewarded with huge bonuses. Doctors who prescribed the most were flown to lavish conferences and showered with gifts. And behind the scenes, the Sacklers were celebrating. Internal emails praised pushing the 80s, the highest dosage pills. These were the most addictive and also the most profitable. But there was a problem. Patients weren't taking OxyContin as prescribed. They were crushing it, snorting it, injecting it. The time-release formula failed when broken, and it delivered a powerful heroin-like high. By 2001, law enforcement was seeing a pattern. Overdoses were climbing, emergency rooms were flooded, rehab clinics were overwhelmed. But Purdue doubled down. They blamed the users, not the drug. They said it was abuse, not a flaw in the pill, and they kept increasing the supply. All the while, they were monitoring it. Purdue tracked reports of abuse, they knew which doctors were overprescribing, they had data that showed red flags, yet they kept sending sales reps to the same clinics. Why? Because it made money. The addiction wasn't accidental,
It was profitable. As OxyContin swept across the country, questions began to surface. How did such a powerful, addictive drug get approved so easily? The answer, as always, lies in the system. When Purdue submitted its application to the FDA, it made a bold claim that OxyContin's time-release formula made it less likely to be abused. This wasn't backed by long-term studies, but remarkably, the FDA approved the label. The wording was vague. Delayed absorption is believed to reduce abuse liability. That phrase, believed to, changed everything. It implied safety, but didn't prove it. And that subtle language gave Purdue the green light to flood the market. But there's more. The FDA official who oversaw OxyContin's approval was a man named Curtis Wright. Just 1 year after leaving the agency, he took a high-paying job at Purdue Pharma. Millions of dollars were involved. Conflict of interest? Absolutely. Illegal? No. That's how the system works. Meanwhile, Purdue began expanding its reach. They trained an army of over 1,000 sales reps, giving them carefully crafted scripts and quotas. Their job? Convince doctors that OxyContin was a breakthrough, a miracle drug. The reps were told how to overcome objections. If a doctor mentioned addiction, they had a rehearsed answer. Less than 1% of patients become addicted. It was a lie, but it was effective. One internal document even instructed reps to avoid using the word opioid because it carried negative connotations. Instead, they called Oxy a safe pain reliever, perfect for everything from backaches to post-surgery discomfort. The term "pain is the fifth vital sign" became a national campaign, pushed not just by Purdue, but by medical boards, hospital systems, and pain advocacy groups, many of whom received funding from opioid manufacturers. Doctors were told that if they didn't treat pain aggressively, they were failing their patients. In a short time, pain pills became as common as antibiotics. For every minor injury or ache, OxyContin was the answer. But behind closed doors, Purdue executives were watching the storm build. Reports of addiction were pouring in. Law enforcement began seizing huge quantities of Oxy on the street. The black market exploded. Still, the company claimed ignorance. They blamed bad doctors, irresponsible patients, street dealers, anyone but themselves. But the truth was buried in their own emails, memos, and sales data. And eventually, someone would gig it out.
It wasn't an accident. It wasn't misuse. It was by design. Purdue Pharma had access to the truth, and they hid it. As early as 2000, just 4 years after OxyContin's release, internal reports showed clear signs of abuse. People were crushing the pills, snorting them, injecting them. They were addicted. Instead of sounding the alarm, Purdue executives doubled down. They pushed for higher doses. Their most powerful version? The 80-milligram pill. On the street, it earned a new nickname: hillbilly heroin. Doctors were seeing more and more patients come back, needing stronger doses to feel the same relief. This was not normal. It was classic addiction. But Purdue trained their reps to call it pseudo-addiction, a made-up term to suggest that patients didn't need less opioids. They needed more. One leaked internal memo from a Purdue executive said it clearly. We need to increase the focus on 80s. They're more profitable. Let that sink in. Not more effective, not safer, more profitable. Meanwhile, in towns across America, especially poor and rural regions, the damage was irreversible. Hospitals began reporting spikes in overdoses. Funeral homes were burying teenagers and young adults, people who never touched heroin but got hooked on prescription pills. Sheriffs in West Virginia and Kentucky called it an epidemic, but no one in Washington listened. Purdue's marketing targeted exactly these areas: Appalachia, Rust Belt towns, economically depressed cities. Why? Because data showed that doctors there were easier to influence. Sales reps used software to track prescribing habits. If a doctor was already writing a lot of pain meds, they became a high-value target. One former rep described it like this: "They told us to find whales, doctors who'd write thousands of scripts. We didn't talk about patient safety, we talked about volume." Doctors were offered bonuses, free dinners, paid speaking gigs. Some were even flown out to luxurious resort conferences where the main message was, "OxyContin is safe. Keep prescribing." All the while, Purdue kept saying one thing in public: OxyContin is not addictive when used properly. But behind the scenes, they knew the data didn't lie. Thousands of reports showed signs of dependency, withdrawal, abuse. Purdue tracked those reports and still denied them. And when families started suing the company after losing loved ones, Purdue blamed them. They said it was the user's fault, that they abused the drug, that addiction was a personal failure, not a product flaw. But addiction experts saw a different picture. OxyContin's time-release coating could easily be bypassed by crushing the pill. What remained was pure, uncut oxycodone, a chemical nearly identical to heroin. And it was everywhere. By 2004, over 160,000 pounds of pure oxycodone had been distributed in the U.S. Communities were drowning in pills, doctors were overwhelmed, and Purdue, they were raking in billions. Each year, their revenue soared. In 2000, $1.6 billion. By 2010, over $3 billion annually, just from OxyContin. But that profit came at a cost. In small towns across America, crime rose, child services struggled to keep up with abandoned or neglected kids, schools began stocking overdose medication. Funeral homes developed youth overdose protocols, a phrase that shouldn't exist. And the Sacklers, they stayed silent. Their names went on museum walls, art galleries, university wings. As the country crumbled under the weight of a crisis they engineered. Still, no one had been held accountable. But a storm was building. Whistleblowers, state attorneys general, investigative journalists, families who refused to be silenced. The truth was coming, and it would shake Purdue Pharma to its core. By 2006, the cracks in Purdue's empire were starting to show. Families were suing. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. The headlines were getting harder to ignore. Doctors under fire for overprescribing painkillers. OxyContin addiction sweeping rural America. Pharma giant faces legal scrutiny. Behind the curtain, Purdue knew things were changing. Internal documents revealed growing concern from the company's legal team. They were tracking lawsuits, monitoring media, preparing for what they called potential reputational damage. But even then, their priority wasn't accountability, it was damage control. In 2007, the first major blow landed. The U.S. Department of Justice filed criminal charges against Purdue Pharma and 3 of its top executives. The charge? Misbranding a drug with intent to defraud or mislead. They weren't being punished for making OxyContin. They were being punished for lying about its safety. In court, prosecutors presented evidence, emails, internal memos, marketing slides, all showing that Purdue knew how addictive OxyContin could be, and said otherwise. And what was the outcome? A plea deal. Purdue paid $600 million in fines, one of the largest ever for a pharmaceutical company at the time. But not one executive went to jail. The Sacklers? They weren't even in the courtroom. Even though they owned Purdue and had final say on every major decision, including how the drug was marketed, they weren't named in the case. Instead, they stayed quiet, watching from the shadows and protecting their fortune. That same year, something else began to shift. Public awareness. A wave of journalists, activists, and grieving families started speaking out. Some whistleblowers had once worked for Purdue. One former sales rep testified before Congress. "We were trained to say it wasn't addictive, even though we all saw the addiction firsthand." Another former executive anonymously leaked documents showing how Purdue tracked doctors, even those under DEA investigation, and still encouraged reps to visit them. And still, the pill mills operated. In towns like Florida, Ohio, and West Virginia, pain clinics popped up on every corner. Patients traveled hundreds of miles just to get prescriptions, no exam needed. The result? By 2010, overdose deaths from prescription opioids had quadrupled compared to 1999. And OxyContin wasn't the only drug anymore. Hydrocodone, morphine, methadone, fentanyl. The floodgates were open. The government began to act, slowly. The CDC issued new guidelines. State medical boards tightened regulations. Pharmacies implemented pill tracking systems. But the damage was done. In towns like Portsmouth, Ohio, or Welch, West Virginia, opioid use was no longer a crisis. It was a way of life. Kids were growing up without parents. Babies were born addicted. First responders carried naloxone in every patrol car. And Purdue? They quietly reformulated OxyContin in 2010 to make it abuse deterrent. You couldn't crush it easily anymore, but it was too late. Addict users simply turned to heroin, a cheaper, more potent alternative that flooded into communities at record speed. The opioid crisis had evolved. It was no longer just about pills. It was about pain, poverty, profits, and a system that put shareholders above human life. But while overdose deaths climbed, while families buried their children, while towns declared states of emergency, the Sacklers grew richer. Internal family emails, later uncovered, showed how they celebrated financial milestones, how they discussed legal strategies to avoid personal liability. They even considered moving Purdue's assets offshore just in case things got too risky. And through it all, they kept donating to museums, art institutions, Ivy League universities, trying to rewrite their legacy in marble and gold while ignoring the blood on their hands. But outside those marble walls, a movement was growing. Victims, activists, journalists, whistleblowers, attorneys general, all building a case not just against Purdue, but against the entire system that allowed it to happen.
By the mid-2010s, something had changed. For over a decade, Purdue Pharma had operated in the shadows of legal loopholes and settlements. But now, the curtain was lifting. More than just a few lawsuits, a tidal wave of legal action was coming. By 2017, over 1,000 cities, counties, tribes, and states had filed lawsuits against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. Their argument? That Purdue and the Sacklers had knowingly fueled the opioid crisis. And the evidence? It was damning. Internal emails were unsealed, marketing memos leaked, whistleblowers spoke on record. A 2001 email from a Purdue sales manager. If a doctor is hesitant about OxyContin, remind them it's safe. The addiction risk is less than 1%. A 2008 internal report to the Sacklers. We are seeing abuse patterns in Florida and Kentucky. Recommend increased PR monitoring. A 2011 family email thread. Should we consider a public spokesperson to humanize the company amid growing backlash? The Sacklers weren't just owners, they were active participants. They attended board meetings, directed marketing strategy, approved sales targets. debated how to spin the addiction crisis. And they weren't subtle about hiding their wealth. Between 2008 and 2017, the Sackler family withdrew over $10 billion from Purdue. That's right, $10 billion. While overdose deaths soared, while parents buried their children, while counties ran out of funding for treatment centers, the Sacklers were funneling money into offshore trusts and shell companies. By 2019, the public pressure became overwhelming. Major publications like the New York Times, ProPublica, and The Guardian were digging deep. Documentaries were being made. Best-selling books like Empire of Pain and Dopesick became cultural lightning rods. The Sackler name was being scrubbed from museum wings. The Louvre removed it. Tufts University cut ties. The Guggenheim said no more. And Purdue? It was cornered. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the beginning of the end. But it wasn't justice, not yet. Filing for bankruptcy allowed Purdue to freeze lawsuits and restructure its debt. It also allowed the Sacklers to negotiate immunity. Yes, immunity. In exchange for a multi-billion-dollar settlement, the family wanted protection from future civil litigation without admitting any wrongdoing. They would walk away free. The public was outraged. Families of overdose victims protested outside courtrooms. Survivors testified in hearings, begging judges not to let the Sacklers escape. They killed my brother, and they want to buy their way out. How is this justice? If I sold a bag of heroin, I'd be in prison. They sold billions of pills, and they're billionaires. But in 2021, a federal judge approved the bankruptcy plan. The Sacklers agreed to pay $4.5 billion, later increased to $6 billion after appeals. In exchange, they got what they wanted. No personal criminal charges, immunity from future opioid lawsuits, freedom to keep most of their wealth, and they issued a statement. We acted ethically and lawfully. We regret that OxyContin unexpectedly became part of an opioid crisis. Unexpectedly. Despite decades of internal warnings, despite profits built on addiction, despite families destroyed, they still claimed innocence. But not everyone accepted it. In a rare courtroom moment, victims were allowed to speak directly to the Sacklers during a public hearing via Zoom. One mother held up her son's ashes in front of the camera. A former user shared photos of their ruined teeth, destroyed career, and 15 overdoses. A father choked back tears as he said, "You'll never know what it's like to bury your child because of your product." And what did the Sacklers say in return? Nothing. They stayed silent. Cameras off, mics muted, faces unseen. Even at the end, no apology, no responsibility, just silence and the sound of lawyers filing out. But this isn't just a story of one company. It's a story of systems, of how profits were prioritized over people, of how regulators failed, of how a lie repeated enough times became accepted truth, and of how the cost was measured not in dollars, but in lives.
Even after all the lawsuits, all the headlines, and all the pain, the opioid crisis didn't end. In fact, it only changed its form. The Sacklers agreed to pay $6 billion as part of a bankruptcy deal, but they still denied wrongdoing. None of them were ever criminally charged. As part of the deal, the Sacklers were granted immunity from future lawsuits, angering victims' families.
Many museums and universities began removing the Sackler name from their buildings, a symbolic move for many, but it didn't bring back the lives lost. While their name faded from walls, it remained burned into the memories of millions. After Purdue's downfall, heroin and fentanyl filled the vacuum. The addiction crisis deepened. Fentanyl, far more potent and deadly, led to a new wave of overdose deaths. Emergency rooms saw a rise in patients. Communities struggled to keep up. Families kept losing loved ones. The faces changed. The drug changed. But the damage? It kept multiplying. Entire towns were shattered. Children were raised by grandparents. Babies were born addicted. In 2022 alone, over 100,000 people in the U.S. died from overdose deaths. Lawsuits continued against other pharmaceutical companies, distributors, and pharmacies. Purdue may be gone, but the crisis it helped start is still here. Today, settlement money is being used to fund treatment programs, prevention education, and overdose response. Activists, survivors, and families of victims continue to fight for justice and awareness. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was a moral one. A business built on pain and death, and it happened in plain sight. Text on screen. Over 1 million people have died from opioid overdoses in the U.S. since 1999. This story is not over. Share it, remember it, and never let it happen again.